Hello everyone, welcome to my Bourne Conspiracy Assassin difficulty walkthrough. This is Mission 6, Silence Rurik, and it starts off with a QTE sequence. So the pattern is always the same. It's R1, then it's one of the face buttons, R1, one of the face buttons, and then for the rest of this, it's just R1, and then there's going to be one button press coming up where you have to press one of the face buttons. That is how the pattern for this sequence will go. And then once we've done this, we will be able to resume control of Bourne. And this begins probably the most grueling mission in the entire game. I'm not calling it the hardest mission, because saying that it's the hardest mission would imply that this mission is well designed, but there are definitely parts of this mission that are pretty grueling for kind of the wrong reasons. And it's really with only two sequences, although some of the other sequences can prove to be rather annoying if you don't have the right amount of adrenaline or the right amount of ammo. But those sequences, I'll talk about them when I get the chance. This initial beginning is very simple because we don't have a weapon until we get to the security station. And we're dealing with guys with clubs right now. I didn't actually talk about the guys with the melee weapons. So, the guys with the melee weapons, you're not going to be able to do the melee loop against them because they get a bit more range on their melee attacks. And because they have additional range on their melee attacks, it's hard to time when exactly you're supposed to do the kick loop in order to deal with these enemies. So it's honestly better to just stun them with the 3-hit combo and then do the heavy kick against them. I mean, that right there, I did use the light kicks against this guy. I just kind of went for it and it worked. But most of the time that doesn't work because the enemy will just be able to frame advantage me with their really fast melee attacks with the melee weapons and get a lot more range than me. Like, they'll literally, like, shift slightly forward, like, right towards you, in order to close the distance to you, and it's something that can stop the kick loop. So, just try to deal with the melee weapon guys by just stunning them with the uppercut and then doing the heavy kick, and just blocking their attacks until they give you an opening. But that's another thing as well. When you're blocking attacks, it's random whether the enemies will give you an opening after they finish their combo. Most of the time, they do, but then there are those times where they immediately start another combo the moment they finished one of their combos. So that's definitely one of the trickier parts to the melee, but it's not something that's life-threatening per se. But we've done the first initial introduction to this mission, and now we have access to the shotgun. This shotgun is slightly different to the one that you used in the previous missions, because this one, I think it's more so an automatic shotgun. It's not quite a pump-action shotgun like the previous shotgun, because you can kind of hold R1 to give it the illusion that it's automatic. So it's a decent shotgun. I don't know if I feel it's as good as the shotgun that you used previously. I feel like with this one, the hit detection is a little bit more ambiguous, but it's just me. Maybe it's not. But essentially, you just need to go through these corridors and just deal with the enemies. You also have access to your pistol in case you need it for longer ranges. This corridor right here, I did get killed by these enemies because I didn't anticipate their spawn very well. These two enemies right here, I'm just going to prematurely fire into the doorway to try to get the drop on them. Didn't work out so well, so I'm just going to use one of my adrenaline bars in order to take out these enemies. And I used two just then. I didn't have control just then over whether I wanted to prioritize one guy or not. On the top right-hand corner, the game gives you an indication as to how many enemies you'll prioritize with the shooting takedown, based on the number of enemies you see in the picture in the top right when you do get the prompt to press circle. So that's why I got two guys instead of just one. I had no choice in the matter. It's a very inflexible option that the game gives you. I don't know why it has to be so rigid in how you choose your enemies. Because in order to select only one enemy, I would have to move Bourne around so that there was only one enemy in my line of sight, and that's how I would be able to pick whether I was dealing with one guy or two guys or three guys in the shooting takedown moment. But we have a mini-boss encounter, and for this part, there are going to be enemies shooting you, but they're only on one side of the arena, so as long as you stay on the other side of the arena and you put an enemy between yourself and the gunfire, you won't be hit very often. The game does indicate that if you put enemies between yourself and gunfire, it will cause the enemies to pause in their assault because they don't want to hit their friend. Don't trust that mechanic. It's not that reliable because there are still a lot of those moments where the enemies will shoot you and they'll kind of bypass the hitbox on their friend to be able to hit you. So try your best to avoid any situation where you're forced into melee and there are enemies shooting you. You want to finish off the guy you're dealing with as soon as possible if you're in a tight spot. And this guy has slightly more life because he's, of course, a mini-boss, so he's going to take multiple takedowns and a lot of kicks in order to go down. And then, once we're past that, we have a shootout encounter in the courtyard, then a boss fight against an APC, which is shit. then a library holdout encounter, then some minor skirmishes with the enemies, then the distillery encounter, and that will conclude this mission. There is a lot happening in this mission, and that's why this mission definitely has some very grueling moments to it because of the amount that you're doing within it. But again, it doesn't necessarily mean it's well designed for a truly challenging experience. Because like I said, with certain encounters, some of the encounters aren't that good in this section because you spend more time fighting the mechanics than you do the actual enemies. But we've dealt with that guy. There are going to be 2 guys with melee weapons. If you're low on adrenaline, I suggest you deal with them so that you have 3 tiers of adrenaline. I didn't need to do that. And so this is where we're going to get to the courtyard section. There's one guy that will ambush you through the smoke, so deal with him. And then from this position, there are going to be enemies on the ground and enemies on the terraces. So this is where I'm going to primarily use my pistol in order to deal with the enemies at longer ranges. And if they get close, I'm going to swap to the shotgun. And I should be using the program behavior of the enemies that I demonstrated in Mission 4, where if you're out of the enemy's line of sight for long enough, if there are multiple enemies around, one of the enemies will try to rush you, and their friends will try to support him. So you see how he's saying, "I'll cover you"? That means one of the enemies is rushing me right now. This is a very crucial behavior to use to your advantage in order to speed up the encounters while also making sure that you're not putting yourself at risk. Because it's so easy to die during these moments when the enemies deal a lot of damage to you, they don't flinch properly from your weapons, and the ambiguity on your hit detection when you're actually shooting at enemies is very high at best. And that was very dangerous. I did not expect that guy to go to that spot. I thought he would just go down the same route as every other enemy, but he didn't. So always pay attention to your map when you're using Bourne Instinct mode to know where the enemies are going, and don't assume they will only go in one direction. But there are enemies on the terraces. One guy is pushing up right now, so I should be swapping to my shotgun. This cover is not safe because it will be destroyed. You can just camp back in the previous room and just let the enemies come to you. This is what I'll showcase in a moment once I've actually removed the enemies from these terraces. The enemies spawn in phases, so you just gotta memorize where they spawn in during these phases and you'll be fine. But this is where you're going to be seeing me fight the reticle once again, as I've demonstrated before in the previous missions. All I want to do is just place my reticle on this guy's head, but unfortunately, because of the fact that the motion that Bourne doesn't properly match with the analog stick, I try to move Bourne ever so slightly, but he overextends way too much. And so trying to move like 1 millimeter with the reticle is so hard to do when you're playing as Bourne because the dead zones on the analog sticks were not properly programmed. Like, they're nowhere near as good as the dead zones in Resident Evil 7, and the dead zones on the analog sticks for Resident Evil 7 are non-existent. The slightest motion on your analog sticks is enough to elicit movement from Ethan, not like in this game. And once again, it's a testament to the low budget that was probably shown with this game. Because this game, it definitely feels like it should have been properly polished and maybe a little bit longer as well. Or like have better set pieces pretty much. But this is what we get with this game, and it's still a fun game, but it could have been better in all honesty. But I'm still waiting for the enemies to show themselves. This guy is not pushing up because he's the only one left. So I'm just going to try to fire at him. I'm just firing blindly. Ooh, something I should mention as well is whenever you shoot at the cover that an enemy is hiding behind, you'll elicit animations on him. You see that? Even though he wasn't behind cover, because I shot the grass right behind him and I shot the wall behind him, it elicited an animation that caused him to stumble because, realistically, if someone was shooting your cover, it would generate enough shock in you to kind of cause you to stumble backwards or something if you're not used to it. It's meant to capture that sort of behavior from the enemies, but the programming on it is a little confusing, and it kind of happens when it wants to rather than being under your control. And we now have this APC encounter. This is a dreadful encounter. I don't know what they were thinking with the mechanics of this game, but the mechanics of this game aren't befitting for this kind of boss. I'm not going to go into cover because staying out of cover for even a little bit is enough for the APC to kill. I mean, look how quickly he put me into red life just then. I'm going to try my best to use the third-person cover trick to my advantage, but with the third-person cover trick on this game, you have to not be so close to the cover, because even though the reticle isn't mapping the path that the bullets take, you have to assume that this game utilizes some kind of laser-sighted system. So if the bullet is going to travel alongside the path of the laser and the laser is clipping into the geometry, then most assuredly the bullet is going to clip into the geometry. So that's why you have to make sure you take a few steps back from the cover in order to ensure that you're kind of replicating a third-person cover trick. And I don't really understand the Seraphim 17 statement about the Bourne conspiracy with the third-person cover trick. I watched him do a balls deep of Wanted Weapons of Fate, and he cited the Bourne conspiracy as a similar game to Wanted Weapons of Fate, and he said the third-person cover trick on this game is broken, but for good reasons. And I don't know what kind of game he was playing, but the third-person cover trick on this game isn't good. It's not very reliable, and I find myself not really using it that much because it doesn't adhere to the same traditional format you're expecting from a game where the third-person cover trick is really reliable, like for instance Uncharted 2 or Uncharted 3, or Dark Sector for instance. Like, this third-person cover trick is not very reliable, and also another problem I have with the sequence is how much Bourne moves when you're making the slightest movement on your analog. Like, the slightest movement on your analog is enough to cause Bourne to move a couple of feet in a certain direction, and so you can accidentally step out of cover a lot of the times and give the APC a free chance at hitting you. And that's yet another problem I have with that fight, and it just doesn't work very well. And it takes more of a beating than it perhaps should. It should only take a couple of bullets to hit this thing, while still killing you very quickly, but it takes quite a beating on its barrels, and that's why you spend a lot more time running the risk of getting screwed by the game, and that's why I hate that sequence. And I don't know if that sequence was worse or this is. I think this is honestly the hardest encounter in the entire game, because the cover is bad. The enemies can shoot you through these stacks of books over here, because of course they're not blocking you from anything. You know, if they're moving books out of the way, there's empty spaces, so they can hit you through those empty spaces. But in some cases, it works to the enemy's favor a little too much, because of the problems I've already cited with the enemies. And this right here, you'll need to walk backwards with your weapon out and then run to trigger the spawn, but also get away from it very quickly. I had to restart this encounter several times in order to try to find some kind of way to do this consistently. But as soon as we get to the top floor, a lot of the consistency isn't there because there are enemies so close to you, and the chances of you accidentally going into melee is really high. And without any kind of cover, it's hard to put yourself in a position where enemies will not shoot you while you're in melee combat. And you see how much of a beating these enemies take as well? Why do they take this much of a beating? And I've already showcased it in previous parts of this walkthrough, but there are just so many moments where the enemies can just tank like shotgun shells like crazy. They can take a full magazine from an assault rifle and they're still alive. The health on these enemies is kind of absurd, and the flinch animation problems only add to this issue greatly. But I'm just checking my surroundings. I don't see any enemies on the map right now. Or I think there's actually, well, yeah, there he is right there. I mean, he was there, but from my perspective with this recording, I couldn't really see the red dot on the map. But I'm going to move up. I'm going to grab that shotgun right over there. It's definitely important you have this for these two enemies. But I make a mistake right here. I push up a little too much. I think it's mainly because there are enemies behind you and they're shooting you while you're getting up the staircase. And I think at the time there were also some other enemies, so that's why I pushed up trying to avoid them. But I put myself in a position where I'm taking a lot of damage, and like, look at this. If this was any other game, there would have been some way to escape combat. I mean, it's just a general basic human trait to escape combat when the situation is going tough for you. But on this game, you're forced to partake in the melee combat while enemies are shooting you, and you have no way of escaping unless you take out the enemy quickly with your adrenaline, or you finish off the enemy with your normal melee attacks. And we have a couple more enemies right over here. This guy's pushing up. He's going to go into cover and then come out of it, so lucky for me that occurred. And there's another guy right over there, so I'm going to finish him off. This is kind of third-person cover trick right over here when I finished that guy off. And I was standing a bit from the cover, and I was able to make it work. This is working as well. I think I'm in the proper position to do the third-person cover trick, but this shotgun doesn't have any range to it, so I should be swapping to my pistol right now. But I guess I was committed to the whole idea of the shotgun having this kind of range, when it really doesn't. I mean, that right there, it did. But I'm guessing with the other guy, he was far enough away that the shotgun just wasn't registering. And also, you'll see the cover demonstrated again. So you see, I shot the cover he was near, and he fell to the ground. See, that gives you an opportunity to shoot them, but they don't flinch whatsoever during that entire animation. And he's still alive, and with how long it's taking, I decided to make a dash towards him and just rush him. And he goes down right over here, and there's a couple more enemies coming up. So I'm just going to use the third-person cover trick right over here. There we go. And that guy is also dead. So we're going to push up. Do not bother dealing with the enemies that spawn from your initial spawn point. I'm just going to run right past them and just trigger the next encounter. I don't even know why they even bother putting these enemies here. There's no point. It's not like you'll get any additional adrenaline. You'll get adrenaline in the next combat encounter. But this next sequence isn't so bad, because you can use the third-person cover trick reliably, and the enemies don't seem to push up on you that much. Of course, if they're staying in cover way too long, I suggest you use the mechanic where you sit out of their line of sight for long enough that they eventually rush you, and just pay attention to your map while you're in Bourne Instinct mode. And coming up is going to be my favorite quote in the entire game. It's when Bourne is talking with his handler. I don't know the name of his handler. I think it's supposed to be Conklin. Was that the name of the handler in the Bourne Identity? But I think it's the same guy that he's talking to during this moment and throughout the rest of these past sequences. But look at this bullshit. How many shots is he taking? That was a full magazine and he's still alive. Absolute garbage. That just goes to show how ambiguous the detection is on this weapon. But here's the quote. Listen to this.
You are the extraction solution, son. We trained you all these years just so you can hail a cab.
Yeah, you hear that? That right there has to be the funniest quote I've ever heard in this game. And if I was like Serum 17 and I had some intro segment before actually debuting my gameplay, I would have probably overlaid that quote over some kind of introductory clip before showcasing the gameplay being shown right now. That's what I would have done. Like, that quote has so much going for it, and I really enjoy it. It's funny, it's serious, it's meant to distract you from the high-octane combat encounter that you're doing, and it could almost be on par with that of a little narrative dissonance moment, but I guess in the case of Conklin, it's meant to display his indifference towards Bourne, how he just views him as nothing but a soldier, this and that, and he doesn't really see it necessary to extract Bourne because he could just do it himself because he's that confident in Bourne's abilities because, you know, he's just a weapon and nothing else. That's definitely why the quote has a lot of meaning to me. But we have a couple more skirmishes with the enemies. I just killed the sniper. You'll want to get rid of that sniper because snipers do a lot of damage on this game, as expected. There's going to be a couple of enemies emerging from that vehicle, so deal with them. And you're going to be seeing yet again another example of the micro adjustment issues being displayed by the game, because two of these enemies are just going to be sitting behind cover. I'm trying to shoot them in the head, and I'm trying to use Bourne Instinct to highlight them so that I know where they are, so that they actually stand out among the environment. And I just cannot get my reticle over the guy's head. And this guy's pushing up because I'm out of his line of sight for quite a long time. I run out of ammo right here, but this is when I realized, oh, it's just better to do the melee on this guy. And we're going to be able to progress onward with ease. So the rest of this mission should be pretty simple. It's just a matter of knowing when the spawns trigger and when you're not supposed to push forward, because it can be very easy at times to get ambushed by a really cheap spawn. Cheap to the point of you can actually see them spawning out of thin air behind cover, and that's pretty lazy spawn tech right there. That's all I'll say about that. So given that the rest of this is pretty simple, I'm just going to go on different tangents. And there's one other modifier I forgot to mention about assassin difficulty on this game. So on the other difficulties, when you're doing quicktime events, it not only gives you the placement of the face button, but it also showcases the cardinal direction of the face button. I mean, obviously, square will correspond to the left side, circle corresponds to the right side, triangle is the top side, and then X is your bottom side. So it puts little circles around the buttons, and it showcases where the button is. And I know it just seems like it doesn't really make that much of a difference, but it kind of does, because there are times where it can be very easy to mistake the button for something else when you don't have the advantage of the cardinal direction system, because of course you have to be very fast with the quicktime events. So in the time you're spent trying to read what the button is, without the indication of the cardinal direction of the button, you spend some additional time just contemplating what the button is, and this additional time can cause you to make a mistake or press the wrong button on accident if you're trying to do these QTEs very fast, because of course the QTEs on this game are pretty punishing for good reason, because they definitely add a level of challenge that I think is kind of cool for this game. So yeah, that's another indication that I'm playing on Assassin difficulty. Not only is my adrenaline draining when I go into Bourne Instinct mode, but you do not see any cardinal direction overlaid over the button, which is an interesting subtle change for a difficulty modifier and for a QTE in general. I wonder why this crossed the developers' minds when they were designing this modifier for Assassin difficulty. Like, did they have Q&A just give a comment about the QTEs and say that without the cardinal directions, it was definitely leading to more mistakes? Maybe there's a psychological process involved with this. I think that's a very interesting perspective to bring QTEs into. But yeah, interesting modifier. Bear that in mind when you go on Assassin difficulty. But this encounter right here is simple. These enemies, just pay attention to where they are on the map when you're in Bourne Instinct mode, and you'll be fine. This guy, he tends to be up on that railing, but he instead decides to go down on the ground. So I'm just going to sneak around the corner and take him down. Look how quickly he turned, by the way. You see that? That's some straight up boomer turn tech from Gears of War, as Serum17 would say about that. The dude turned in an instant, just completely breaking the rules of human motion right there. No human being can move that fast. That was just a straight up teleport right there. What a load of bullshit. Straight up boomer turn right there. But now we have this final encounter at the distillery. So there are two enemies. One guy is up top, the other enemy is down below. For the guy that is down below, I'm going to actually take advantage of the cover system for the enemies in order to knock him out of cover and then rush him so that I can build up my adrenaline. So watch, I'm going to shoot the bottles, he stumbles to the ground, and this gives me the chance to close the distance to him while he's busy recovering from the animation. That is a pretty reliable method in case you need it. This distillery encounter, it's best you have at least 2 bars of adrenaline, because there are roughly 4 enemies coming up, and because the room is quite claustrophobic, it can be very easy at times for the enemies to get the drop on you, and there's not a lot of cover here. So this is precisely why you need to eliminate the enemies as soon as possible so that they do not ambush you. But I pulled the switch, and they're coming right now. So this is where I am going to use the shooting takedown in order to take down these enemies. So there's one, and I managed to get him through a wall right there. I'm guessing because Bourne's model went right through the geometry, that just allowed Bourne's model to be in perfect line of sight with the enemy, and that's why that was able to work. Very odd. I've never had that happen before. But those 2 enemies are dead, and there are 2 more enemies left. So this guy comes very close to killing me. So when you get to this spot right here, you need to swap shoulders and just try not to go out of cover to deal with that enemy. This guy, he moves in this direction, and he stumbles because I shot the cover right next to him. And that is pretty much the end of the sequence. There is one guy over here, but he gets killed instantly in a scripted sequence, and there are no more enemies. So once you have escaped the distillery, this will be the end of this really grueling mission. Stay tuned for the future missions. Thank you all for watching, and you take care now.